Now let's come and talk about the sacrificial system. And two aspects of the sacrificial system. First, the offerings, and then we'll take a look at the priests, those who brought the offerings into the presence of Yahweh. And I've given you a chart on the offerings. And we're just going to take the burnt offering because in many ways the same terminology then is used for the other animal offerings of the peace, sin, and guilt offerings. And particularly because the instruction given concerning the burnt offering is very specific. And I think as we look at it, is very revealing and corrects some of our misconceptions about the involvement of the offerer with his offering. So I've already read, beginning in 1:2, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you..." So it's a man who brings an offering, and certainly is seen in the Torah that a man represents his family. So if there is a wife, children in his family, and even an extended family, that it could be that he has nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters, but he is viewed as the leader of that family. That when there is the need for these personal offerings, that he is the one who brings it. When any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd of the flock. And usually the offerings were animals, though obviously in chapter 2 we have the grain offering, but again, the same basic requirements of the involvement of the offerer before the offering was passed on to the priest. And he says that if his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, so we're looking here obviously at the young bull, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. And verse 5, he shall slay the young bull before the Lord. Only then, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer up the blood and sprinkle the blood around on the altar that is at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Verse 6, he, most likely here, going back to the one who slaughtered the animal, he shall then skin the burnt offering and cut it into its pieces. Then in response, verse 7, the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire on the altar and arrange the wood. Then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head, the suet over the wood which is on the fire that is on the altar, its entails, and its legs he shall wash with water. Probably again going back to the offerer. Then Aaron's, the priest, shall offer up and smoke all of it on the altar for a burnt offering, an offering by fire of smoothing aroma. So as you can see from the chart, all right, the actions of the offerer. He is the one who brings the animal. By the way, notice, he has to determine the animal. He has to make sure it's the right type of animal, right age, without blemish, etc. I mean, he is the one who selects the animal, the offerer, not the priest. The priest doesn't come out the tabernacle and say, hey, you want to bring an offering? Well, I'll go down, look at your herds, and I'll point out the ones that you can choose from. That's the offerer's responsibility. So you got to bring the right animal. You've got to put your hand upon the head. This is association, identification. I identify with this animal. What's happening to this animal is what I realize needs to happen to me. This animal is taking my place. Notice, and how many Christians I share this with, and they're almost dumbfounded. It is very, very clear. I mean, there is really no debate about the preposition in verse 5. He shall slay the young bull. Or verse 11, he shall slay the sheep or goat. Now, when you get to the birds, for some reason, the priest is the one that wrings its head and offers it up in smoke. I don't know, maybe Israel didn't do too good butchering birds. I don't know. Why God. But the larger animals, notice, it is the offerer who kills the animal. Yeah, but I don't like killing animals. I faint at the sight of blood. Well, you better not sin. I mean, you've got to personally slay the animal. Now, obviously, the blood is collected by the priests and splattered on the altar, but it is the offerer who has to cut the animal so that the pieces can be placed on the altar. He is the one that washes the entails so that they may be placed on the altar by the priest. And in Leviticus 7:8, you also find out that the hide is kept by the priest. So the butchering is basically that you have to kill it, and then you got to be the one after the blood is drained. You got to be the one basically to butcher it, clean the entails, and of course the hide is given to the priest. So the offerer is the butcher. That, gentleman, is personal involvement. You don't only select the animal from your flock. In other words, so it's personal. You're giving up an animal. You're giving up the right kind of animal. You're identifying with that animal. You are butchering that animal. You're the one putting it to death and dividing it up. So in other words, if I put it this way, you cooperate with the priest to make sure that the offering is brought to the Lord in the proper way. It's not all on the priest. Most people have this idea, I just get this animal and I just drag it to the priest and say, okay, it's up to you now. Go do it all. And that is not true. The grain offering. Once again, he brings the offering. He takes the handful to give it to the priest, and then the priest burns that handful and then eats the rest. But again, realize the priest doesn't act until the offerer is acted. The peace offerings, the sacrifice of peace offerings. And once again, I spell this out. The offerer again brings the offering, puts his hand on the head, kills the animal, cuts the animal, and uniquely, chapter 7, he eats part of the animal. And by the way, he's got 2 days to do so. Third day, whatever's left, has to be burned up. So because of that, if you got a peace offering and you got 48 hours, you got 2 days from the time you butchered it and the priest has taken the part that goes to Yahweh and has given back part to you, that you got at that point. You got till sundown the second day to eat it. And you got to realize that you didn't go down to In-N-Out and get a burger every day in the wilderness. You didn't show up to Christie's Steak, every weekend to get, a nice steak. You had meat. Well, you had meat usually after an offering, and the peace offering is the one you got back. So the peace offering is a time when obviously you would call others to help you because you could. Anyone can join with you in eating that meat as long as it's during the first day or the second day after the offering. Third day, at that point, you're dead meat if you eat it. All right? Some of you picked that up. Good. And then we have the sin and the guilt offering. And once again, those follow the same pattern that is seen in the burnt and the peace offering, so I didn't spell it all out, except with the guilt offering, you also have to bring restitution. Restitution has to be made. If it's to the Lord, then obviously given to the priest. If it is to another party, if you've stolen something or caused injury that has led to some kind of loss, then you are to replace that plus 20%. And so repentance really in the Old Testament was not completed without restitution. So the proper offerings, but also with the guilt offering, restitution as well. Now to see what is said in chapter 1, the burnt offering was to atone, to make atonement on his behalf. And of course, he is bringing that as a representative of his family, on his family's behalf. So it's atonement. The grain really is not said, although we can see this, to render tribute to the Lord. The peace offering. It's only when we get to chapter 7 that in verse 16, but if the sacrifice was offering is a votive or a free will offering. Right, a votive or free will offering. That, I'm sorry, let's missed the first one in verse 12. If he offers by way of thanksgiving. All right, so this is a thanksgiving offering. And then verse 16, a votive or a free will offering. Those are your three. So here's something, gentlemen. If God answers your prayer, if you pray out and ask and request of God, and God answers, your thanksgiving is to be associated with a peace offering. If you make a vow, at the end of that vow, you are to bring a peace offering. And if you've just generally just rejoicing in shalom, the fact that there is harmony between you and Yahweh, a free will offering. It is to be done by means of the peace offering. And so the peace offering seems to be just that. It is a declaration made that there is harmony, that there is fellowship. There is no barrier between Yahweh and the worshiper. And that could be reflective of the fact that you are thankful because God has answered your requests, or that you have made a vow that has now come to culmination, or just generally you're just extolling and raving and just delighting in the fact that you're in fellowship with Yahweh, and you can come into Yahweh's presence and you can be able to express that. It is significant that these three offerings are called sweet aroma offerings. That they bring a sweet aroma to Yahweh. The American Standard calls it a soothing offering, an offering by fire of a smoothing aroma to Yahweh. But when we get to the sin and the guilt offering, these are non-sweet savor, although, again, in chapter 4, chapter 5, these are offerings that are for atonement in the same way as the burnt offering. But they're not sweet aromas before the Lord. And so this seems to be tied into the fact that there needs to be this offering because there has been a sin, an unwitting sin. So in chapter 4, verse 2, if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, all right, then he is to bring the sin offering. Verse 13, the whole congregation of Israel, through verse 21. Verse 22, the leader. Verse 27 to 35, anyone of the common people. And then, as we see beginning in chapter 5, verse 14, once again, if any person acts unfaithfully and sins unintentionally, not only the sin offering, but now also a guilt offering. So the sin is to be dealt with, and also the ramifications, the repercussions of sin as well. That sin has to be forgiven, but the breach which sin has brought needs to be repaired. And so an unwitting sin leads to both sin and guilt offerings, because both are entailed. You have broken God's standard. You have missed the mark. And that has created some rupture in relationship with Yahweh and with those who have been sinned against. And so both sin and guilt offering are the responsibility. And notice in this context is if one sins unwittingly, if one does not sin with a high hand. In other words, you're caught into this sin. You didn't set out. You didn't get in the morning and say, you know what? I'm going to deceive and steal some money from neighbor Abraham this morning. It's just unwitting that, and who knows, you might have confused his flock with your flock, and taken one of his good animals, and you didn't set out to deceive and steal, but that's what happens. So guess what? You sinned. You missed the mark. You've broken the commandment. You got to deal with it. So you stole one of his animals, it's going to cost you two. Because you've got both the sin and the guilt offering. You not only have to give him his animal back, but depending upon how much the value of the animal is, you've got to add 20% above and beyond that. Sin's costly, gentlemen. Sin is costly. It costs you substance. It costs you time. It costs you energy. Sin is just disastrous. It is better to do it the right way. It's a lot healthier. It's a lot more cost effective. Think of all the anxiety you save as well, all the mental anguish you go through. So this is a reminder in Leviticus. I mean, sin is not something to be taken lightly. Now, the way it seems to work, it is interesting that we have in the actual speak to them about the offerings and when they're to bring them, how they're to bring them to the sons of Israel. It goes burnt grain and peace, then sin and guilt. Then, interestingly, as you can see in chapter 6, we turn away from the offerings to verse 8 and 9. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law for the burnt offering. Right? This is your responsibility when it comes to the burnt offering. Then he goes on to the grain offering, to the sin offering, to the guilt offering. And it's only in chapter 7, verse 11, now this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings. So it's very interesting that these 5 offerings, divided as sweet aroma and non-sweet aroma, 5 offerings, and the middle offering is the peace offering. When you come to the priestly instruction, 1, 2, 4, 5, and then the culmination and longest description is given concerning the peace offering. That the structure of both, as the culminating soothing offering and as the culminating offering period in the instruction of the priest, puts special emphasis upon the peace offering. So how does it seem to work? Well, if you sin, it has to be dealt with. Sin breaks the rupture. It ruptures the relationship with Yahweh. You can no longer come into Yahweh's presence until that sin has been dealt with the sin and guilt offering. That repairs the rupture. That takes place of the past. But there needs to be a reestablishment of what? Consecration to Yahweh. So also tied into atonement is the burnt offering. That I deal with the past, but I recommit myself in the present to wholehearted consecration to Yahweh, which includes the grain offering, all that I have. And so once again, there is shalom, there is peace, there is harmony, there is fellowship. And on that basis, I can also render the sacrifice of peace offerings. And of course, you can bring peace offerings and the burnt offering even when sin is not involved. And the grain offering, because they're sweet stuff. I mean, you can consecrate yourself to Yahweh anytime. You can declare peace with Him and declare that all that you have is His through the grain offering. You can do that at any time. But particularly when there's sin and guilt involved, that has to be handled, and then, as it were, the relationship with Yahweh reestablished, in the sense that now you are free to come into Yahweh's presence and worship and enjoy fellowship with Him again. The breach of sin has been handled. And so, we'll have to wait just a second, I'll take the question. But we'll have to wait and talk a little bit about what is atonement, but these offerings are the basis of atonement. But also, they are the basis of forgiveness. And this is reiterated again and again. Verse 20 of chapter 4, so the priest shall make atonement for them, that's the congregation of Israel, and they shall be forgiven. The leader, verse 26, that the priest shall make atonement for him in regard to his sin, and he shall be forgiven. This is not only the basis of atonement, it's also the particularly the sin guilt offerings, are the basis of forgiveness as well. There's a sense in which when you've done everything right and brought the right offering, and you see that portion of the offering that's to be consumed on the altar, when you see it consumed in smoke, you have the assurance of what? God has accepted the sacrifice on your behalf, and you stand forgiven. Now, I've read Hebrews 2. Well, how could they be forgiven when forgiveness only comes through Christ? Well, because who do these offerings represent? Who do they point to? Christ. So it's the experience of forgiveness. It's not that that animal bore the sin of the offer, and somehow this is the sin bearer bearing, the sin away. But it is the idea that this offering anticipates and looks forward to the ultimate offering. And on the basis of that ultimate offering, as this animal is consumed in the smoke by Yahweh, there could be at that point the assurance, all right, sin has been dealt with. Sin has been forgiven. But we do remember it was a psalmist, Psalm 103, who spoke about the fact, as far as the east is from the west, so far my sin has been removed from me. As someone living before Christ who made the statement of his complete assurance that sin had been taken away and sin had been dealt with and sin had been forgiven. So yeah, the Old Testament saint could be conscious of the fact of his forgiveness before Yahweh. And the means by which that came about was priestly mediation. So it's interesting that as you come to the end of the offerings and the latter part of 6 and 7, this is what the priest has to do. Well, if the priest has to do this, you better have priests. So what had been authorized in Exodus chapters 8 and 9 is put into practice. Aaron and his sons are consecrated, 5 priests, and in chapter 10, almost immediately after the consecration, 5 priests have become 3 priests. And the sin of Nadab and Abihu, which again we'll look at the interpretive issue.